I thought this was a great subject for a 10-15 minute daily drawing exercise because in some ways it's relatively simple structure. It's basically a box with some decoration, but it's got some parts that come out and recess back in and some decorative work. This low relief in the centre on the front and a bit of carved work up top. And therefore I thought it's a great subject to practice perspective angles, to practice proportions, because while a squarish shape is often easier, there are a lot of sections and carvings in this. So keeping the proportions correct so that our overall shape looks right and all the various elements of it look right as well. And part of that is making sure we get the perspective angles correct that move up in one direction and down in the other direction, because eye level roughly goes through the center of this, is all great practice. And it will be easy enough to see at the end of our drawing whether we've captured the proportions correctly, whether we've captured the angles correctly, and whether our marks, lines, whatever we put to try and capture the relief and the carvings are successful as well. Now, certainly in a 10-15 minute drawing, we're going to be drawing the effect of the detail of the carvings, not the actuality of it. In fact, I'm really trying to, in this time, draw the effect of the overall structure. So when it comes to the parts of the basic box shape that come out and go in, I'm not agonizing over drawing lots of precise lines close together. I'm basically on this scale drawing all my lines in one flicking movement, I think of it as. There's only so far you can draw these and keep them straight. Otherwise, when we pivot on our wrist, which is what happens when we do a flicking mark or line, it tends to curve towards the end. We start to pull our hand back towards our wrist. And so this isn't a way of making marks particularly advisable for lines that are too long, but it is a great way of doing lots of short lines both quickly and getting a nice brisk feel to our lines. And because I want the overall drawing to have a brisk feel, that works for me on this scale. But if I were drawing it half as large again, I would have to do more thought out straight lines. And that, of course, would make me take a lot longer to draw it. So I start with this center patch where I find that if I start in the center, particularly where eye level is more in the center, it's easier to keep the perspective angles correct than going upwards and going downwards. And of course, what we have to keep remembering is that every horizontal line that goes above eye level slightly increases in angle, and in the other direction, below eye level, slightly increases in angle the other way. And it doesn't really matter how close together those lines are. We want to try and have a slight change in them. And you'll see my normal practice, when I draw from a photo, that is, I put a dot where I estimate by eye where I think the angled line will go to, and then I check that against the photo by measuring my pen against it. That way, I get the best of both worlds. I get to practice estimating the angle, and that's great for times when that's the only means I'm going to have of drawing an angle. But I also get to, if you like, critique my estimation immediately. And if it's not right, I can correct it, and I can take with me the learning experience of that correction. Particularly if I find that my lines are consistently not high enough of an angle or too high an angle. It lets me make adjustments to any natural default error my observation or thinking or line work creates, and then I can compensate for that. So checking our angles as we draw is really great. The other thing too is that if I realize I've got an angle not quite right and for some reason I can't correct it too much, then in the next angles above it or below it, I can compensate. I can split the difference of the error so that overall the error doesn't look too out of place. And so I'm moving up, and also aware that the left-hand side of this is foreshortened in relation to the right-hand side. And so everything I do on the left will be smaller, will be not as high, and will be narrower to what's on the right-hand side. And of course the same angle though will be happening on the left and right-hand side if the detail that we're talking about lines up horizontally. And then I have these carvings here. Now you'll notice how I do the carvings. I'm really drawing the shadows, and I'm not even drawing the shadows precisely. I'm trying to capture the effect, the feel of the architecture by drawing the shadows that the detail creates. And I am feeling a bit pushed for time at this point. As it turns out, I draw the entire thing in just under 10 minutes, except for the decorative elements, that square relief in the front and the carving in the little pedimented section above. I presume this is some sort of military monument that I came across in a park in Hobart, Tasmania. Quite possibly it's a memorial to a distinguished Tasmanian military officer, or it could be for a whole brigade or some such group that served overseas somewhere. But for now, continue with capturing what it is and not having to worry about what it was for. Now, this would have been a nice drawing to have planned to do the background and the trees and the different values, the chance to push it forward, but I decided that would take it way beyond the time I wanted to spend doing this, and I think in some ways it does stand alone quite happily. So all I do is just the barest of marks at ground level to indicate that it is on the ground and not tumbling through space, and I leave it at that. So again, foreshortening's working between this closest corner and the extreme right-hand corner of the structure as well, in exactly the same way. The detail on that far side becomes narrower and shorter. And now I realise that that bottom line is not very great, the one in the centre of the front, so I correct that. Always correct things that aren't looking right as best we can. And now we just have the base section. This is where it's perhaps easy to not pay as much attention to our perspective angles. It's easy to flatten them all out too much because we're thinking, oh, we're nearly at the ground and the ground's level, and we often think of perspective angles as something that moves upwards because most of the time that's where the emphasis in the perspective angles are, and it is still the case in this one. However, the angles do shift considerably if we look at that first sort of really obvious to see perspective angle that slopes in the other direction, and then the lines underneath that. There is quite a bit of shift in the angle. So we want to capture that because it gives a lot of reality, visual reality, and interest. This is a pretty geometric shape, for want of a better word, and the difference in perspective angles in different angle direction is visually part of the interest of what we're looking at. And now we just have that ground level mark, and again pay attention to the fact on that right hand side of the ground that even though the ground is sloping downwards in life, and it's sloping downwards in the picture, the actual line or marks that I use to create a roughly line effect actually goes upwards. It's so counterintuitive, and it's one of the reasons that we have trouble drawing downhill so often. I can still remember when I was in the middle of a live drawing session and I was doing a slight downhill slope, and I realized this. It absolutely dumbfounded me. I'd never heard anyone mention it before. And having realized that, it makes drawing downhill so much easier. So we have moved into double time now. We're getting towards the end. I'm doing this decorative relief. Now, probably the only comment I make about that is that it's slightly too large. It fits comfortably within the shape, but it is wider than and larger, so it does have a more squeezed look than the reference. It's not something that looks out of place. It doesn't look distorted. But if we're trying to draw accurately in relation to our reference, it's important to notice when we critique our drawings afterwards if we do this, because sometimes drawing the details too large will absolutely limit the effectiveness of our drawing. It will really look as if it hasn't quite worked for some reason. So it's good to have that takeaway thought for the next drawing. I must be careful not to make the detail too large. But otherwise, this is it. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Please hit the like button if this was helpful and interesting. You'll find it's not quite it. You'll find this reference photo, of course, on my channel community page. So why wouldn't you have a go? It's such an interesting shape to do. And if you're finding this series helpful, this is number 61, and I'm sure you couldn't possibly have done the other 60. So why not work backwards as well as forwards with this series? And if you've got friends who draw, please help me out and help them out, I suspect, by letting them know about this series and how helpful it's been to your ongoing drawing development. The idea is to make daily drawing as easy and as accessible as possible for you, so that you can benefit from this incredibly helpful learning technique, learning process. But hey, whatever you draw, however you draw it, however often you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.